Hello, welcome to the channel Wise Stories. Enjoy watching.
A wealthy and well-off family had come to Bali to indulge themselves in the warm tropical sun and the insanely beautiful ocean water. Not that it was particularly necessary for Antonio, but it was essential for his beautiful wife and their little daughter. Less than 4 years had passed since Antonio started his small business. For this, he rented a suitable space, equipped it, adhering to all the necessary standards for this activity, then purchased special licensed machines and started crypto mining. Engaged in this simple business, all the work was literally done by the mining machines. For many people, it still remains a mystery how these so-called workers make money. While some are still considering engaging in something more useful, others cannot dare to start exactly this way of earning money. Antonio was fully promoting his company. Yes, despite the fact that all the main work was done by these computational machines, it was necessary to perform no less other tasks. For example, to recruit personnel who could service the machines, deal with accounting and other documents, as well as think about how to increase their income and scale up. There were many tasks, and all of them were quite serious, but Antonio seemed to be naturally adept at this business. In 2 years, in addition to his first branch, he opened 2 more similar ones, but in other cities of northern regions. Antonio was immensely pleased that he had chosen this path of activity. The sphere of activity was completely new and unfamiliar to a huge number of people eager to occupy themselves with something, so here the main thing was to think well but briefly, and act. In addition to ordinary people who wished to have passive income, large players also came into this sphere of activity, pondering where to invest their dollars and other currency. And here it was already really interesting. Tony, his wife Veronica, called him by the name. "Could you swim with our daughter? I want to sunbathe a bit, so that the tan is as even as possible," she asked him. Usually, they always took a nanny with them, but this time they decided to spend time with their family. Antonio took his 3-year-old daughter and put her on his back. By this time, they were already in the water. Antonio deliberately rented a private beach for his family. The water pleasantly caressed the skin. It was indeed very warm and had an incredibly beautiful emerald color. Real relaxation and color therapy. Antonio looked at his wife, who was standing right in front of him. Veronica raised her hands up, pretending to be a supermodel. She was glad that despite her pregnancy and childbirth, she managed to maintain a gorgeous shape. At every convenient opportunity, she boasted of the attractive curves of her body. Antonio liked that his 30-year-old wife still behaved like a teenager. He loved his wife madly and was grateful to fate for introducing them. Always being in perfect athletic shape, Veronica seemed to treat people around her just as strictly. She was quite a demanding girl. Sometimes even Antonio laughed about it, saying, "Well, how did I deserve such an honor of meeting you, my princess?" Then he enveloped Veronica in his arms and bestowed tender kisses upon her. This was something Veronica truly enjoyed. She genuinely loved her husband. Despite the fact that Antonio had to exert considerable effort to convince her to become his girlfriend first, and then his wife, every day he loved her more and more. He liked her soft facial features and the bold strictness of her character. He considered her pragmatic and thoughtful, perhaps even too much so. But they say we attract similar people to ourselves, so Antonio had something to work on with himself. However, Veronica's sharp mind and Antonio's intuition allowed the latter to bring his firm to a good level of income. Gradually, the family moved from an apartment to a big house. First, one car was bought, then another. As a means of transportation, a yacht appeared too, on which the family loved to relax, as it was Antonio's dream to buy his own yacht. It was small, but everything in it was so conveniently and beautifully done that he didn't see anything better. Veronica ran her hand over her smooth and even skin. Here, on these wonderful islands, the tan turned out to be truly extraordinary. Veronica admired Antonio and her daughter, whom they called Rosalia. That's what her father named her. Veronica didn't mind. She remembered the day when they laid her tiny little baby, wet and swollen, on her chest. At that moment, Antonio was next to her, holding her hand and looking into her face, and his eyes were filled with tears of happiness. How quickly time flies. And now little Kalia is riding on her father's back. She, like him, loves water and is ready to spend hours in it. Antonio taught her to dive underwater and feel relaxed and confident in it. Rosalia grasped everything very quickly. And now, at the age of 3, she splashes in the water like a golden fish born in the sea. "Mommy, come with us," shouted little Kalia, calling her mom to join them. But Veronica didn't want to wet her hair again unnecessarily. She preferred solitary swimming somewhere nearby with the family. After the water procedures, the family went to an expensive restaurant. It was famous for its interesting design and luxurious cuisine. With a constantly growing income, the family didn't have to worry about money spent. The waiter brought appetizing salads and a plate of seafood prepared in various ways. After a hearty dinner, Veronica decided to stop by the store to pick up a few new outfits. Antonio and Kalia waited for Veronica to finish trying on her new dresses. With her stunning figure, Veronica didn't have to worry about anything not fitting her properly. Any clothing looked incredibly good on her. The next day, Antonio and his daughter went back to the ocean shore. Veronica decided to stay home. She wanted to be alone and rest. Antonio and Kalia, on the contrary, were eager to reunite with the water. Antonio deeply loved his daughter and made sure to give her enough attention. On this sunny hot day, they immersed themselves in the water again. Antonio deliberately chose a suitable place with shallow depth and a smooth bottom. Colorful little fish showed curiosity towards the arriving guests. They swam into the green thickets and hid among the seaweed leaves, watching the swimmers. While Antonio was busy with his daughter, he never ceased to be amazed by her incredible abilities. He noticed with astonishment that this little creature grasped everything on the fly. The 3-year-old girl had no fear of water. She trusted it, and it, in turn, protected her. The vacation time came to an end. It was time to return to the city. Happy and sun-kissed, they arrived back in homeland. A maid was waiting for them at home. The girl named Carmen had been working for them for about 4 years. When Veronica became pregnant, Antonio seriously considered finding a suitable candidate for household help and assistance with the future child. And since he knew that his wife was very fastidious, he took care of it in advance. Carmen turned out to be the new candidate. Strangely enough, after talking to her, Veronica had nothing against her. Antonio was glad that he had dealt with one of the tasks. And indeed, settling on Carmen, the family never regretted it. This girl grew up in an orphanage, never had a real family, but always dreamed of it. After the orphanage, she graduated from a pedagogical college. Subconsciously, she knew how to get along well with children of all ages. So, when she found this job through an advertisement, she realized that she would be in her element here. Carmen was composed, responsible, and fully aware of her place. During Veronica's pregnancy, the two women became very close to each other. They practically became friends. Veronica could share some of her concerns and anxieties with Carmen, who always supported her and could dispel any clouds that hung over her head. Carmen perfectly combined two roles, being the best friend and a household helper. When little Kalia was born, the family needed her help even more. Working with an open heart, Carmen quickly became friends with the daughter. So, Carmen gained another person who wanted to entrust her with secrets. "Carmelita, hi." Rosalia chattered joyfully as she crossed the threshold of the house. Carmen greeted the girl with open arms. "I have so much to tell you." Kalia hurriedly took off her sandals. "Come in, my dear, and you too," Carmen greeted them as if they had come to her house. "I've prepared a delicious lunch, so let's undress, wash your hands, and sit at the table," she said, heading to the kitchen. Veronica followed her into the living room, while Antonio went to his room. "Oh, Carmen, you can't imagine how wonderful it is there," Veronica said in a sweet voice. "Of course not, I've never been there," the maid replied with a laugh. In reality, Carmen knew she was very lucky with the people she worked for. This family was characterized by great kindness and integrity. During her time working for them, she had traveled with them to several countries several times. During the trips, Carmen had to look after little Kalia. Finally, Antonio came down to the living room. He had taken a shower and put on a fresh shirt. Carmen glanced briefly at him. This man was very handsome. With a soft character, he persistently pursued his goals in this world. Carmen knew that Veronica was in good hands and protected. She could only dream that someday God would also give her a good man. Ha, and they didn't even give me a fork. Well, I can manage with my fingers, Antonio said cheerfully. Everyone laughed at his joke. Carmen looked surprised at the table, then got up to fetch another utensil, but the man beat her to it, swiftly approaching the cupboard with dishes. Carmen was standing right there. She was about to get a couple of mugs. Antonio, trying not to hit the maid, decided to move her aside a little. Unexpectedly, Carmen felt his hands on her waist. She opened her mouth in surprise, but tried not to give herself away. Antonio, as if nothing had happened, took out the fork and returned to his seat. Carmen, however, was confused by this unexpected behavior. She tried to quickly dismiss the thoughts from her mind. When lunch was over, Antonio went to the office. There was work to do, checking on the employees and reviewing some documents. But the family wasn't saddened by this. Veronica and Kalia had received so many impressions and emotions that they were ready to go to bed right after lunch. A couple of hours later, Antonio was already home. By that time, his family was asleep. He peeked into the kitchen. As usual, Carmen was tidying up. Seeing Antonio, she offered him a cup of coffee. Antonio was always amazed by the perceptiveness of this girl. He agreed. Usually, Antonio would take his coffee or another drink with him and go to his office or another room, but this time he did differently. Even though Carmen was busy working and folding towels, he sat down next to her at the table. He sat silently, sipping his coffee. Carmen again remembered his accidental touches. She felt how these memories intrusively invaded her mind. She involuntarily glanced at his hands. They were more than beautiful for men's hands. It was understandable since Antonio never did any heavy work. His skin was smooth and even tender. It seemed to Carmen that he even held the mug in a particularly soft way. Lost in her fantasies, she stood still holding the towel. Finally, Antonio noticed. He saw her gaze, which seemed to stick to his hands. "Is something wrong?" he asked the girl. Carmen didn't return to the real world right away. Feeling his gaze on her, she looked up. "Carmen, everything okay?" Antonio asked again. Carmen was at a loss, not knowing what to say. She could only silently gaze into Antonio's eyes. In the next moment, she allowed herself too much, lowering her eyes to his lips. Antonio stood up and approached Carmen. Her heart beat faster, and her face flushed with fire. Antonio leaned slightly towards her and reached out his right hand. The girl, as if enchanted and unmoving, stood in place. It seemed to her that Antonio wanted to touch her, and indeed his palm was very close to her face. But the next moment, he grabbed something with 2 fingers and pulled it out of her hair. "A feather," he said, "almost got into your eye," he said, presenting to her this almost weightless reason for his interest in her. After that, Antonio took his last sip of coffee and left the kitchen. The girl was left alone. She tightly closed her eyes and covered them with her hand. She felt very ashamed and uncomfortable about her so silly and inappropriate behavior. She took deep breaths, trying to calm herself down. Pressing her palm to her face from both sides, she felt its warmth. Yes, Carmen was not indifferent to Antonio. At 20, she had not yet experienced relationships between a man and a woman. Antonio, one could say, was the first to pay her so much attention. She had to admit that she liked Antonio and was attracted to him as a man. He was intelligent, handsome, and good-looking in every way. He knew how to take risks and stop in time. He was restrained and gentle, but at the same time, he knew exactly what he wanted from life. On one of the usual days, Carmen simply realized that she was in love with him. This in no way affected her work or her attitude towards Veronica or Kalia. Carmen continued to impeccably perform her duties. She cooked lunches and took care of the little girl. But at the same time, she didn't stop secretly loving this man. After this incident, she tried not to be alone with Antonio anymore, so as not to tease her imagination. Moreover, she didn't intend to give reason for jealousy to Veronica. Their friendship and trust in her were worth much more than all of this. And pulling herself together, she continued her work. Over time, Antonio decides to expand his firm. 6 months ago, he had already opened a new branch in Northern region, with its predominantly cold climate and short summer, was the perfect place to develop a mining business. Moreover, the electricity costs here were several times lower than in other cities. Now it was neighboring countries' turn. The choice fell right on the capital city's large, developing, with great prospects for the future. Moreover, Antonio had acquaintances here, with whom it was easier to advance in business. His partners were happy to develop in this direction with him. Antonio had just begun to feel out the ground and gather the necessary information for a new start. He decided not to rush, preferring slow and deliberate actions. When he returned to homeland and stopped by his office, his secretary approached him. "Señor Espejo, a very important person has arrived to see you. He has several questions and proposals for you," the young woman in an elegant suit reported. "Yes, Adela, let him in," Antonio replied, looking at his watch. He realized he had another 30 minutes free. Soon a man entered his office, who was clearly over 40. He had a presentable appearance and looked quite solid. The secretary introduced him as the director of a holding company called Entrust, which deals with investments. "This is Gonzalo Salas," Adela said, offering a choice of coffee or water with ice. Señor Salas politely declined. Sitting opposite Antonio, he began his conversation. "As I've already been introduced to you, Señor Espejo, I'm involved in investments," he began, lightly rubbing the fingers of his right hand against his palm. Antonio managed to notice 2 large rings on his ring and middle fingers. Despite the gray hair, Señor Salas had a rather stylish haircut. His neatly trimmed beard elongated the oval of his face and made his personality even more intriguing. He was dressed in a dark brown jacket with thin white stripes and matching brown trousers. Señor Salas learned about Antonio's firm from his assistants. Once, their director instructed them to find new investment opportunities. After studying the market, they came across the staggering figures of Antonio's mining company. This young lamb was making a huge profit just from buying and selling bitcoins. Barely out from under his mother's skirt, he had already organized his own cryptocurrency market. Major players, having substantial amounts in their accounts, flocked to Antonio like bees to honey, ready to entrust him with their fortunes. This significantly undermined the activities of Gonzalo's holding, which desperately tried to attract clients to invest their money. "I know you've worked very hard and, one might say, raised your branch in North from zero, but my assistants have thoroughly studied your activities. You're successfully developing your firm. God forbid, one wants to ask how you manage it." He joked. Antonio listened attentively and barely smiled, maintaining a friendly tone. Señor Salas fell silent, waiting for an answer. "Is it me to tell you what it's like to grow a company from scratch?" Antonio replied. "I believe you understand this much better than me, and you have more experience." Antonio had no intention of revealing all his cards to this person. In response, Gonzalo smirked. Chuckling, he continued, "It's nice to hear such things about oneself," said Señor Salas. "Nevertheless, I dare to offer you something." He stared intently into Antonio's eyes. "I assure you, you will be more than satisfied. You will be able to provide a carefree life not only for yourself, but also for your children," he continued with a series of preludes. Antonio didn't quite understand what he was talking about yet. "What is this proposal?" I'm burning with curiosity. Antonio played along, as if deliberately. Gonzalo caught this barely perceptible mockery. Something in his eyes sparkled, causing Antonio to feel a dislike. I propose that you sell me your branch in North. Trust me, I'm capable of paying you in full. I understand perfectly well the sacrifice I'm asking you to make. Senor Salas didn't take his eyes off, as if trying to press on Antonio's unwavering resolve. I understand your desires and aspirations, Antonio replied. Surely, in your position, I would also try my luck by making such an offer. A pause ensued. Senor Salas pierced Antonio with his gaze. But, unfortunately, I have to decline, Antonio said, maintaining his gaze as if resisting pressure. And yet, I think such an offer shouldn't be accepted in just a few minutes, so I suggest you think it over. Give yourself time to reflect and weigh everything carefully, Senor Salas insisted. I'm sure that's the final answer, Antonio added. Maybe some coffee after all? He suddenly suggested, deciding to change the subject. But Senor Salas wasn't in the mood for jokes. Just now he had been put in an awkward position. Never before had he had to yield to some kid. This pathetic and despicable little upstart even had no intention of sharing with him. Tapping his fingers on the table as if drawing attention to himself, Senor Salas bid farewell and left the office. Senor Salas's family, as one could already understand, was quite well off. Having a wife and 2 adult daughters, Gonzalo held not the least position in the city. Like other owners of large companies, he even wielded some influence over the city's economy. He was respected and valued. Often he visited major projects to solve some issues, but lately, with Antonio's company expanding, his popularity inevitably began to decline. This greatly hit his self-esteem. Partners who had once been loyal to him now switched sides. They refused to cooperate with Gonzalo, believing that investing in his projects yielded very little profit. Senor Salas had nothing left to do but accept the situation. He returned home filled with anger. His family immediately sensed this from his abrupt body movements. How dare he, this pathetic kid? Gonzalo asked with hatred in his voice. He's incredibly arrogant and overly confident. He sat on the sofa in the living room and lit his pipe. How did he behave? He didn't even flinch. Not a hair moved. What a cheek. He has no idea who he's dealing with. Gonzalo lit his pipe and puffed on it. Thinks he can just brush me off by rejecting my offer. Fool, he muttered, staring straight ahead. His gaze was slightly clouded, as if he already saw what awaited Antonio. Senor Salas, the maid addressed him. Perhaps you'd like some calming tea? She asked with excessive concern. This only irritated Gonzalo even more. Better pour me some calming wine, he said, and brought the pipe back to his mouth. At that moment, his younger daughter entered the living room. 25-year-old Susanna was incredibly beautiful. She was of short stature with a slender figure. Her black hair and brown eyes made her appearance even more vivid and attractive. Susanna was his favorite. The elder, Eleonora, resembled him more. She had the same nasty character, was persistent and stubborn. She couldn't be argued with. Often, conflicts arose between her and her father because of this. Yes, Eleonora was also very smart. Her calculating nature and coldness helped her in managing the business. However, when she was with the family, she remained just as nagging. She always tried to impose her opinion everywhere and tirelessly argued her point of view. It was different with Susanna. She had a mild character and always listened more than she spoke. But the most pleasant thing about her was that she never contradicted her father. She always supported him and considered him the best and most successful. "Daddy, what's wrong? Are you upset about something?" she asked, sitting down next to him. The servant immediately filled her glass. "Not yet, my joy, but things could get much worse than they are now," her father replied. He continued smoking his pipe and silently stared ahead. Throughout all this time, Susanna remained by his side. She liked silently sitting next to her father like this. She knew he would be silent for a while and then continue speaking. Susanna, my daughter, Gonzalo continued, you're mature enough now and should be able to handle certain matters. The girl looked at her father with interest. I need your help now more than ever, he said. Yes, of course, Dad, you can ask me anything, Susanna said, looking at her father intently. I know you have a sharp mind and a strong character. You have a certain patience that allows you to achieve your goals. Gonzalo looked closely at Susanna. Dad, what are you trying to tell me? His daughter asked again. And then Gonzalo told his daughter that there was a very interesting and promising company they should befriend. However, the director of this firm was quite clever, so they had to employ their cunning and ingenuity. He also told his daughter that she must by any means become a partner in Antonio's business. You must become his assistant, his faithful servant. He's just opening a new branch, and he needs support and an experienced specialist. I know you can handle this task. You're attentive, diligent, and responsible. Susanna looked at her father and deep down rejoiced that he had finally entrusted her with a worthy task. Before this, Gonzalo had always shielded his daughter in every possible way. He didn't want her to work too hard or worry about various work-related matters because she was his favorite daughter, and he wanted her to live her life in happiness and harmony. On the other hand, Susanna had always envied her older sister, who from an early age was very independent and freedom-loving. And most of all, she envied how often her father expressed his pride in such a successful daughter. Susanna was left with praise for her peaceful nature. It wasn't enough for her. Dad, I'll try to do everything as you ask, said Susanna. You shouldn't try, you should do it, Gonzalo said with a different tone. After that, father and daughter exchanged a clink of glasses and drank wine. After the conversation with her father, Susanna began to think about how she could integrate herself into Antonio's company. In fact, it turned out not to be so difficult to do. It was enough to open the company's website and click on the vacancies button. Luck immediately smiled upon Susanna. An office manager was needed in one of the company's departments. Let's start small, Susanna thought, rejoicing in a good start. Having prepared properly, Susanna went for an interview. The conversation was with Antonio himself. How strange, the girl thought. Does Antonio really handle even the smallest tasks himself? The girl was dressed in a fairly modest yet provocatively short dress. High heels along with the revealing dress made her legs even longer. The girl had done a good job with her makeup to make her gaze expressive and her lips more sensual. She had to make an impression on Antonio. In your resume, you write that you excel at any office equipment, speak 3 languages fluently, and have no trouble reading technical language, Antonio repeated, reading from the paper. Then he looked at Susanna. She maintained a calm demeanor, behaving artificially reserved. Yes, that's correct. That's me, the girl confidently replied. Well, you're a good fit for us, Antonio said, believing that such a specialist was exactly what they needed right now. Susanna was assigned her own office. She began working on reports and forecasting. While fulfilling her daily duties, she simultaneously absorbed various information about mining work. She tried to gather as much information as possible to perfect her skills. Striving for her father, she was ready to spend hours on end in the office. After 6 months, her efforts were not in vain. She had studied the mining industry very well and understood some of the patterns in the processes. Thus, she really began to understand something and could even suggest her own ideas for the situation's development. And Antonio also noticed Susanna's successes. He was glad that he had once hired such an employee. Over time, she became his chief assistant. Once, Antonio and Susanna stayed at work longer than usual. They worked on one of the projects. Susanna, using her beauty and charm, decided to seduce Antonio. That evening she was in a beautiful white blouse and a tight long skirt with a slit. As mentioned earlier, the evening dragged on. Antonio briefly left his office. He wanted to take a short walk and start the car to warm up the engine. It was deep winter, so it was simply impossible to do without heating. During Antonio's absence, Susanna rushed to his desk. She began rummaging through one drawer after another. She wanted to find something she might not know yet. After all, her father asked his daughter to be his eyes and ears. You must know about Antonio's activities not as an employee of the firm. You must know what's inside. You must see, hear, and think like Antonio, her father said, and Susanna diligently fulfilled her beloved father's request. Unfortunately, Susanna didn't manage to find anything. Moreover, she almost got caught by Antonio with a folder in her hands. Putting it back in the drawer, she, to distract Antonio, grabbed a glass of water and spilled it on her blouse. The water instantly absorbed into the thin fabric, making it transparent. When Antonio entered, he saw embarrassment and confusion on Susanna's face. "I'm so clumsy sometimes," she said, trying to wipe the excess water from her soaked blouse. She continued to smile awkwardly and try to fix the situation. In this way, she wanted to draw Antonio's attention to herself. It should be added that she liked him. She was sure that Antonio, seeing her charming neckline, would undoubtedly be seduced. However, the desired reaction from the man did not follow. "This is a sign that it's time to wrap up work," Antonio said, handing Susanna a napkin. With that, his attention toward the girl ended. Taking the napkin, Susanna tried to hide her disappointment. To some extent, she was even offended that Antonio perceived her only as a business partner and didn't consider her as a beautiful woman at all. It angered her that he didn't let her get under his skin. After all, Daddy would be very pleased to learn that Susanna managed to get so close to the competitor. At the thought of her father's approval, the girl's lower lip trembled slightly. She was ready to do anything for his praise. Continuing to play her flawless game, Susanna got closer and closer to Antonio. Once, she even managed to visit his home. Here she met his wife, Veronica, and their little daughter, Kalia. Antonio and Susanna were rushing to meet one of their colleagues from work. They didn't have time to stop by the restaurant, so they dashed home. Here Carmen had just prepared a delicious lunch. She set the table for 4, including little Kalia. The dishes were simply excellent. During lunch, Veronica asked about Susanna's successes. She was simply charming. She complimented Antonio's wife and his daughter. "You're already so big and independent. It's so cute. You're so much like your dad," Susanna said, trying to please the little girl, but little Kalia had a different opinion. She didn't like Susanna at all, so she didn't want to talk to her. Despite all her attempts to talk to the child, she only responded with silence and a frown. Strange. This is the first time with Rosalia, Antonio noticed. The adults laughed. But it wasn't just little Kalia who didn't like the guest in the house. Carmen, who was watching everything from the sidelines, also caught herself thinking that Susanna didn't leave a very pleasant impression on her. The girl seemed artificial and overly kind. It seemed like she wanted to get under their skin. But despite this, Carmen didn't show any emotion. After all, it wasn't her business. Besides, this girl only came for lunch, and she probably wouldn't be here again. After everyone had eaten, Susanna began to praise the food and thank the cook. She did it with excessive enthusiasm, but she still managed to create a good impression of herself and achieve the desired effect. "This girl has a good grip," Veronica said when she and Antonio left the house. Carmen didn't reply and just shrugged. She didn't think so herself, but she didn't say anything bad about Susanna. The cryptocurrency market reached a new level. More and more people were getting involved in this sphere. Everyone wanted to have an additional passive income. But as the number of such people grew, Antonio's profits steadily increased. On this occasion, Antonio organized a small party, a restaurant was booked, and top managers of the organization were invited. Among them was Susanna. Antonio still remembered the day she first came to their office. Round tables filled the entire restaurant, good music played. The guests took their seats. As always, a host was invited, who conducted various contests and entertained the guests. Veronica, Antonio's wife, was also at the event. Their daughter Rosalia stayed with Carmen. The party was really interesting. Unexpectedly for Antonio, many of his employees expressed their gratitude to him. They were genuinely glad to be part of this company. "We're up for any challenge," Esteban said cheerfully. Applause followed. "Let's warm up the winter together," another shouted. In response, there was a prolonged "oh." As is known, due to the constant work, mining machines get very hot, and for them, on the contrary, cold is beneficial. Susanna sat at the same table with Antonio and his wife. She occasionally glanced at Veronica, assessing her appearance. During their conversation, she had already understood that this woman was quite intelligent and quick-witted. Most likely, she helped her husband in many ways. Surely, Antonio owed her a lot, including what he had achieved so far. Susanna immediately understood that this woman was not simple and had a very good intuition. She tried not to show it, although she was choosing the right moment herself. The time came when Antonio was called to the stage to give a speech. He knew this moment would come, so he was prepared in advance. He looked at his wife, as if wanting to share this exciting moment with her. Veronica smiled back at him and said, "You're the best." "Love you," Veronica said. Antonio kissed her in response and playfully glanced at her attractive outfit. The long golden dress with a deep neckline looked simply stunning on her. And the necklace that Antonio had recently given her matched her image perfectly. All eyes were focused on the stage. Antonio, dressed in a beautiful expensive blue suit, began to speak. It was unusual for him to speak in front of such a large audience, but he had to overcome this fear and say the words everyone wanted to hear. "I'm glad to welcome everyone gathered here at our party." There was a loud applause. "We are a real big united team. And, actually, this is priceless. It should be noted that this is the most important thing in any organization. And these words should not sound pompous in any way. We are like a skeleton on which our hot mining world depends." The hall filled with applause again. Susanna also listened to Antonio and paid attention to every word he said. He was a magnificent man. Too bad he's already taken, Susanna thought to herself. She cast a jealous glance at Veronica. Without taking her eyes off the stage, Veronica listened to her husband. Yes, she's lucky with him, Susanna thought again. She had to admit that Veronica, despite being a mother and much older than her, looked incredibly beautiful. Antonio said his last sentence and raised his glass. Everyone present supported him. After the toast, the party continued. Antonio and Veronica returned home around 3 in the morning. They were noticeably tired and wanted to get to bed as soon as possible. Veronica fell asleep as soon as she touched the pillow. Antonio, on the other hand, couldn't get rid of the extra thoughts in his head and couldn't fall asleep. He thought about the future of the company, about development, and about future plans. Finally, he drifted off to sleep. He dreamt of his wife. Veronica was so beautiful and ethereal. She smiled at him sweetly and told him she loved him. Her face was radiant with an incredible golden light. In this dream, she seemed somehow unreal to him. She reached out her hands to him. Antonio wanted to take her hands, but for some reason, it never happened. Antonio woke up again. The pre-dawn hints were just beginning to appear in the black sky. Antonio wanted to go back to sleep, but he couldn't. He sat on the edge of the bed. Turning his head, he looked at Veronica. She was sleeping in the same position as she had laid down in the night. Antonio was very glad that he and Veronica had met. This was the woman he wanted to spend the rest of his days with. A slight smile touched his lips. He reached out and gently ran his hand over his wife's shoulder. A strange feeling from the touch lingered on his fingers, as if someone's voice had spoken to Antonio, and without much thought, he grasped his wife's wrist. A few seconds later, he was horrified to discover that she had no pulse. Antonio called an ambulance. The emergency medical team arrived and confirmed his suspicions. His wife had died of cardiac arrest. Fear and horror froze in Antonio's eyes. He couldn't understand why God punished him like this. But no matter how much he wanted to change everything, you couldn't argue with fate. The ambulance doctors tried to find out if Veronica had taken any medication or pills. They suggested that perhaps some medications were incompatible with alcohol. But Antonio had a hard time accepting their assumption. Veronica had always been very vigilant and strictly monitored the health of not only herself but also all family members. Conducting a series of analyses for examination, doctors finally referred to Veronica's death as resulting from the incompatibility of medications with alcohol. Antonio plunged into sadness and despair. This tragedy hung over him like a black veil. He didn't want to develop anything further or make plans for the future. It seemed like the meaning of his life was lost. One day, Antonio sat on the couch, filling himself with alcoholic drinks. After his wife's death, insomnia became his faithful companion. He could sit alone in the living room for a long time. Time after time, he filled his glass with strong drinks, but, strangely, he didn't get drunk and sleep never came to him. Fortunately, all this time, Carmen was by his side. She helped Antonio take care of his daughter. Carmen tried to gently explain to the girl the loss of her mother, and it seemed she succeeded. But with Antonio, everything was much more difficult. She saw how he struggled and suffered, but she couldn't help him. Fairy tales that could be told to a little child no longer worked on an adult. "Señor Espejo, you need to pull yourself together," Carmen said quietly. After Veronica's death, Carmen stopped going home. She was afraid to leave Rosalia alone. Antonio, in such a state, simply couldn't control his actions and take care of his daughter. "Do you hear me?" The maid addressed him. Antonio remained silent. "This can't go on forever," she said sternly. Then, softening a little, she added, "You need to keep living. Veronica wouldn't have liked how you're treating your daughter now. She needs her father. Especially since you and she have a very close and trusting relationship." There was silence. Carmen had nothing more to say. She couldn't constantly reprimand Antonio for his behavior. He had to understand for himself that he needed to be strong for his daughter. "Sit down, please, next to me," Antonio finally said. Carmen approached and gently sat on the edge of the couch. "Thank you for not leaving our family," he said, and fell silent again. "I must say that your family has become like my own, especially little Rosalia. I just can't leave her at such a moment," Carmen said softly. "You're right, I need to pull myself together." "I will try to do that," Antonio said and looked into the girl's eyes. It was in them that he saw his new life. Life, as before, stretched out in a series of days. Antonio found the strength to continue living and enjoying life with his little daughter. He threw himself into work, trying to set himself as many tasks as possible to come home in the evening and fall asleep soundly. He also didn't forget about his daughter. Once a month, they went to the sea. There Antonio had fun and acted silly, as if he were a child. He could only do this thanks to his daughter, who, due to her age, immersed him in this childish and joyful world. Rosalia continued to improve her swimming skills. She could hold her breath for much longer now. Thanks to the water, they seemed to cleanse themselves and wash away all the negativity and sadness. By the age of 7, Kalia could swim long distances. Antonio rejoiced in his daughter's achievements. Sometimes he even organized races with her, swimming against each other. Of course, he let Kalia win, but there was so much laughter and joy. When Antonio recovered from his wife's death, he once again thought about the branch he had started opening in the foreign capital. Unfortunately, he hadn't paid enough attention to it, and it hardly developed. But now, 3 years after the loss of his wife, he felt ready to take on the business properly. Packing his suitcase, he booked a plane ticket and flew on the next flight. It was a fine autumn day. It was a time when autumn, without rain and slush, gave people good, warm, and dry weather. This short business trip already promised to be successful, so Antonio momentarily forgot about household chores. Meanwhile, Carmen woke up from a deep sleep. Opening her eyes, the first thing she felt was a terrible headache. The woman managed to lift her head from the pillow. She tried to remember the recent events in her life, but she did very poorly. More precisely, she couldn't remember anything. And only the piercing pain told her that she was no longer asleep. She couldn't even figure out what time it was or what day it was. Carmen looked around and immediately realized that she was in the hospital. Staggering, Carmen reached the door, then walked to the nurse's station. A young woman in a turquoise cotton suit, seeing the girl, immediately led her back to the ward. Already on the way, she informed the patient that she had been unconscious for 2 days. Carmen sank into even greater confusion. Soon she was visited by a doctor accompanied by another nurse. Carmen looked at them questioningly but received no answer. "You were pulled out of the pool just in time," the doctor finally spoke, an elderly man with very sympathetic eyes. "You swallowed water. A minute later, and you would have been impossible to resuscitate." The girl started. "What pool? What water?" she asked in bewilderment. "How did this happen, and who pulled me out of the water?" The doctor pulled the nearby stool closer to the bed and sat down. He clasped his fingers together, paused for a couple of seconds, trying to find the right words. "You see, memory loss is quite natural in your case. Clinical death always causes some changes in the brain, but fortunately, they are often reversible with proper treatment. You were pulled out of the water by a pool cleaner who came to your employer's premises exactly on schedule. It was as if God kissed you. Everything coincided so well." The man suddenly coughed into his fist, took a handkerchief from his shirt pocket, and hastily wiped his forehead with it, or rather, fortunately for you. "Carmen, do you remember that you were a housekeeper while also combining the duties of a nanny?" The doctor's reaction didn't sit well with the girl. She cast an almost insane glance at him and then at the nurse, afraid to make any sound. Of course, she remembered little Kalia, her work at Antonio's house, and her responsibilities. But now the tone of the medical worker had changed, and Carmen's heart quickly beat faster as soon as he mentioned the word nanny in the context of resuscitation and death. Unfortunately, the girl was much less fortunate, as they say in pediatric hospital. "I'm very sorry. Her father has already been informed about what happened." "What? This can't be true, she swam so well. What happened at the pool?" The doctor simply shook his head, indicating his lack of knowledge about the situation that occurred in the backyard. The police also found no explanations for it. Everything seemed like an extremely unfortunate coincidence. Still not believing the doctor's words, Carmen felt something inside her collapse. Tears welled up in her eyes, and, unable to resist anymore, she burst into tears. The doctor immediately asked to bring her a sedative, then left the distraught housekeeper alone. After some time, a young woman entered the ward. Carmen recognized her as the nurse she met immediately after waking up. She handed her a phone and smiled sympathetically. "You know, they can transfer you to day hospitalization as early as tomorrow. Your test results are very good. It's almost a miracle." She placed the smartphone on the bedside table. "Call your loved ones. Maybe they've lost you." "It's me who lost my loved one," Carmen said quietly, her voice completely colorless. She was alone in the ward again. Antonio's phone didn't answer. A sense of emptiness consumed the girl from within. It couldn't be said whether she had come to terms with the terrible news, but resisting the doctor's words was pointless. But thoughts of Antonio troubled her. If she felt so bad, then how did the father feel, who had to organize his child's funeral? The next day, right after the 4-drip, she headed to Antonio's house. Inside, she was met with an eerie silence. She walked from room to room, trying to find her employer, but the house was empty. Then she went out to the backyard. And there she met her savior. 30-year-old Juan was cleaning the pool, and upon hearing the sound of the sliding door opening, he turned around. "Carmen, are you okay? I was so scared that day. you can't imagine, despite his slightly cheerful tone, his voice still carried sympathy. The girl. I know, Juan. I know. Thank you. You did everything you could back then, she bitterly replied to the cleaner. Where is Senor Espejo? I really need to see him. I'm terribly worried about him. He went to take Kalia. Saint Maria, it's just terrible. First Veronica, and now. How long ago did he leave? About 10 minutes ago. You just missed him. The girl immediately ran out. She didn't want to leave Antonio alone in such a difficult moment. Her head was spinning badly after the drip, and her legs were still a bit weak. But she still wanted to support her last dear person. Catching a taxi, she headed to the hospital, but this time, to the morgue. The man stood in front of the entrance to the department. He couldn't bring himself to step over the threshold. He just couldn't. The thought that everything happening to him was unreal itched in his brain. To bury his wife first, and now his daughter, it was not something one could expect from life. Antonio wasn't ready to take the body, because right now, as long as he didn't see it, Kalia was still alive in his mind. Taking her now meant saying goodbye to her in advance, even before the funeral. Senor Espejo, I think it's time to do this, Susanna said quietly, putting her hand on the man's shoulder. The funeral ceremony will be today. There's no point in delaying the inevitable. The businessman sighed heavily. He stood there silently for about a minute before opening the door. The smell of formalin hit his nose, causing a momentary nausea to rise in his throat. The orderly greeted the grieving father and led him to a separate gurney. On it lay a small body under a sheet. With trembling hands, Antonio pulled back the white cloth from his daughter and looked into her peacefully calm face. She looked like she was just sleeping. The morgue workers had already prepared the body for burial. They had done everything incredibly carefully. Only the lace on her right shoe had come untied. Apparently, Antonio accidentally pulled it along with the sheet. Senor Espejo, you're here. Carmen rushed into the department, trying to dodge the orderlies who didn't want to let her in. The man turned around, but there was no hint of joy in his eyes. On the contrary, it seemed that he felt burning hatred towards his servant. You wretch, how dare you show up? Suddenly shouted Susanna, and immediately grabbed the bewildered girl by the elbow. Because of you, the child drowned, and you come to look at her cold body. While Carmen tried to grasp what was happening, Susanna had already dragged her out of the morgue. The housekeeper couldn't withstand such pressure and pushed the lady away. I spent 2 days in intensive care, woke up, and the first thing I hear is about Rosalia death. The girl began to yell with tears in her eyes. I don't even know what happened back then, and how we ended up in the pool. Just let me find out under what circumstances Kalia could have drowned. Kalia. Our Kalia, who swam better than me or any other adult. Carmen knew that Susanna was the only person who could tell her everything. When the two women found themselves in an empty corridor, Susanna revealed her true face. Her expression changed, and in an instant, a spark of madness lit up in her eyes. You managed to survive after all, it seems. Susanna looked at Carmen with an assessing gaze. The girl didn't understand what she was talking about. Listen to me, my dear servant, she addressed her. Her lips with red lipstick formed a disgusting curve. From today you're nobody here. Do you understand what I'm saying? Susanna hung over Carmen like a cobra, spreading her hood. What are you talking about? What does this all mean? Carmen asked, gradually beginning to understand. The maid already had doubts about Susanna's good intentions. It was evident from her pretense and insincerity. But now she was convinced of it completely. Why can't I talk to Senor Espejo? Carmen asked again. Your dear Senor Espejo has no intentions to see you right now, Susanna replied. By the time he calms down, this vile girl will be lying in the ground, and no one will hear her. But since you turned out to be among the survivors, you'll have to answer for everything. Susanna grinned widely. I feel so sorry for you, so sorry. She pretended to be sad, and then laughed. How dare you do all this? You killed this innocent child, Carmen said, afraid to believe it. Better ask how I managed to get this magnificent liquid. I spared you some extra drops. I thought there wouldn't be enough, Susanna hissed, and you're heavy as a cow. I even sprained my wrist while trying to push you into the water. You passed out right on the edge of the pool. But I should have dealt with the girl first, not you, then I wouldn't have to struggle like this now. While I was pushing you, the brat was lying on the lounger. I didn't have time to throw her to you. There was a pause, after which Carmen's eyes widened even further. So, you killed Veronica too? Is it really true? The girl covered her mouth with her hand, but how could you pass Kalia off as dead? I was saved. Why didn't they notice anything? Carmen figured it all out, and it made her feel even worse. You're really so naive, Susanna sighed. Money can force doctors to make anyone dead, just not in the literal sense. I hope prison will at least teach you some sense. Antonio hasn't filed a complaint against you yet. Everything happened very quickly. He only returned from his business trip this morning. And it all happened because of Juan, whose existence Gonzalo's daughter simply didn't know about. His intervention wiped out the entire initial plan, according to which Antonio was supposed to accidentally find Carmelita and Kalia unconscious in the pool upon returning from his business trip. The poison left no traces in the blood, so from the outside, it would have looked like an accidental death, just as it happened with Veronica. Convulsions, panic, any minor cause, that's why they both drowned. But then the pool cleaner showed up, and she had to back off. She had to improvise. Susanna quickly found out where they had taken the sedated Kalia that day. It was the pediatric department of the district hospital. And if she managed to bribe the doctors there, she couldn't do the same in the hospital on the other side of town. The only way out of the situation was to blame the servant for the girl's death. A terrible fear enveloped Carmen. She felt it squeezing her veins and quickening her pulse. Looking around, she searched for at least one witness, but there was none. The corridor was empty, and the only orderlies on duty were with Antonio now. Get out. Run, hide from the police, you wretch, Susanna smirked sickly. Daddy will be proud of me, and you'll rot in jail. Stunned by this sudden revelation, Carmen didn't know what to do. She turned around and slowly walked to the exit. Her legs didn't obey well, her head was foggy. Antonio probably wouldn't believe her. After all, this snake arranged everything in such a way that the servant indeed looked guilty. Susanna, wearing the role of a mourner, continued the charade. She approached Antonio again, leaned her forehead against his shoulder, and even managed to theatrically shed a tear. It all happened so fast, so suddenly. We didn't have time to understand anything, Susanna said, making up every word on the fly. Antonio patiently waited for her to speak. Essentially, there was no rush anymore. His daughter, his little girl, had fallen into a deep sleep forever. They were swimming in the pool with Carmen, and everything was calm, and there was no hint of trouble, Susanna said, wiping her tears with a handkerchief. He knew his daughter was an excellent swimmer. The absurdity of it all made his forehead even more wrinkled. But he didn't argue with the death certificate and the police's assumptions. He didn't have the strength for that. The girl choked with water, and we didn't have time to save her, unfortunately. Forgive us, she said, continuing to feign mourning. Antonio found it hard to believe what Susanna had just told him. He knew his daughter swam perfectly well and certainly couldn't drown in her own pool. But, as it's known, death has its own plans in this regard. Antonio stood in front of his daughter. She didn't look dead at all. The father wiped his tears and looked at her again. His attention was drawn to the lace that had come undone on her shoe. He approached and tied it with a firm knot, as he did as caring father when his little girl was still alive. Having dealt with the shoelace, Antonio placed his hands on her shins. For the first few seconds, he continued to feel warmth in his palms, and then he realized that the warmth was coming from a living person. His daughter was alive. She's alive, the father uttered, but it seemed like no one heard him. Susanna pretended not to hear. Antonio, without saying a word, touched his daughter's neck and felt a faint pulse. Susanna watched all this and couldn't understand what was going on. "Antonio, what are you doing?" "Snap out of it," Susanna said indignantly. "You're out of your mind." "You need to take a sedative," she said, looking around. She made sure that the orderlies had left for the documents, and there was no one else in the hall. "Shut your mouth," Antonio replied angrily. His words rattled Susanna. She suddenly started to hysterically complain that nobody appreciated her. "I tried to help you. And this is how you repay me for my kindness?" she said, not realizing that she was talking nonsense, but Antonio paid her no attention. Susanna began to realize that her game was getting out of control. So she decided to play differently. She raised the sheet and covered Kalia, then brought a glass of water from the nearest cooler. Antonio gave her a cold look and told her she could drink the water herself. "I understand you're not yourself right now. It's very hard for you to accept all this," Susanna babbled incessantly, actually looking for an escape route. However, she comforted herself with the hope that if the police hadn't arrived yet, everything was still okay. She continued to pretend to help Antonio and take care of his daughter. "Don't go near her, not even a step," Antonio ordered her in a commanding tone. Meanwhile, Carmen remained outside. She couldn't let everything go unpunished. This lunatic first killed Antonio's wife, and now his daughter. The entrance door opened. Susanna peeked out and measured the maid with a cold, almost annihilating gaze, then stepped back from the passage, silently inviting the girl to enter, and then returned to the morgue where Antonio and his daughter were. She knew Carmen would come to them. When the maid appeared before Antonio, Susanna hastened to accuse her of the girl's death. "Señor Espejo, forgive me," Carmen said, deeply regretting what had happened. "I didn't want to tell you this to avoid upsetting you again," Susanna suddenly began, "but I saw the maid give the girl poison to drink," she shouted. "That's not true," Carmen objected. "How dare you brazenly deceive us all?" "I have your fingerprints on the glass," Susanna tried to salvage the situation with her last strength. "Shut your mouth. You're a lying snake," Antonio yelled at her. His words made Susanna pull herself together and sober up a bit. Realizing that everything was going downhill, Susanna decided to take the company's documents and flee. This lady had prepared them for herself in advance. At the cries, one of the orderlies rushed into the hall. Seeing Susanna, whose eyes literally shot lightning, he quickly understood everything. The young man stood frozen, and feeling Antonio's gaze on him, he abruptly rushed towards the exit. He was the one who had supported Kalia in her lethargic sleep, and he had drawn up all the documents, from the autopsy results to the death certificate. But outside, he immediately ran into the police, who instantly handcuffed him and led him back. In front of everyone present, this man appeared already in coma state. Carmen, while standing outside, guessed to call the police. "Susanna Salas, you are under arrest. You also have the right to remain silent," said the policeman, flashing handcuffs. Susanna tried to resist and say something in her defense, but the law enforcement officers seemed to pay no heed to what she was saying. They calmly carried out their duties. Somehow, news reporters and journalists learned about the family tragedy. They had already arrived at the morgue and eagerly waited who would appear first on the dilapidated porch. Susanna appeared. Bright flashes of cameras immediately followed. Journalists extended microphones to get a few words about the incident. Despair and madness engulfed the criminal. Meanwhile, Señor Salas sat by the television screen. He savored every word of the journalists reporting that the home of a successful entrepreneur had once again been visited by misfortune. However, when he saw his daughter's face on the screen, he perked up and turned up the volume. "Daddy. My daddy won't leave me like this. I'm his favorite, he'll do anything for me." She squealed, her voice breaking. "It's all for him, he would praise me, he would be so proud of me." Señor Salas couldn't believe that his daughter was escorted by the police. The man realized that everything was lost and that an even worse fate awaited him. This influential man understood that it was best for him not to move at all and not to take any action. The police declared his daughter guilty of the murder of Antonio's wife, as well as the attempted murder of his daughter. Later, during interrogation, it was revealed that Susanna turned out to be mentally unstable. She envied her independent and successful older sister so much that she simply went crazy at the thought of fulfilling any, even the most insignificant, request from her father. Gonzalo couldn't come to his senses from all these circumstances. Everyone around now knows whose handiwork it is. Panic attacks gripped him, and his already weak heart continued to ache and squeeze in his chest. His doctor prescribed bed rest for him. Soon, without the main owner of the company, his conglomerate began to fall apart at the seams. But this hardly concerned the boss anymore. He lay hopelessly in bed, unable to overcome such an unpleasant turn of events. As for Antonio's daughter, she underwent rehabilitation in the hospital. Doctors, promptly called, managed to prevent the girl's death. Moreover, the lethal substance with which Susanna wanted to poison both the maid and Kalia had already begun to be eliminated from the body. The young woman divided the dosage into 2 doses for little Rosalia and adult Carmen, and it turned out that it was not enough to cause cardiac arrest. Therefore, the victims only fell into a deep sleep, and the bribed orderly had to maintain the right dosage in the girl's blood. Doctors administered IVs to the girl, restoring her entire body as a whole. The action of the poison was successfully stopped, and the consequences of hypothermia, dehydration, and fasting were immediately treated for several days. Soon the girl began to recover very quickly. All this time, the maid was by Antonio's side. She had become so attached to this family that she didn't even entertain the thought of leaving them, of never seeing the little girl again, and not seeing Antonio. She supported Antonio in every possible way and tried to help him get through these harsh days. One evening, when Antonio's daughter was discharged from the hospital, they arranged a celebratory dinner among close friends and relatives. It turned out to be a good heartfelt dinner, after which everyone went home. Only Antonio and Carmen remained. Carmen watched as the completely healthy Kalia drew in her notebook. This warmed her soul and made her feel joyful. While Carmen watched the girl, Antonio watched her. He was struck by how devotedly this woman had served their family. For 8 whole years, Carmen had been by their side in both sorrow and joy. She didn't seek a better place for herself. He also saw that Kalia, due to her young age, had forgotten Veronica and perceived Carmen as her own mother. As cruel as it may sound, that's how children's minds work. Moreover, for the past year and a half, Antonio had begun to notice that he felt something more than just friendship towards Carmen. And now, as he looked at her, he caught himself thinking that this woman was truly beautiful. Her inner beauty was reflected in her graceful facial features, neck, and entire body. Carmen didn't notice how Antonio placed his hand over hers. Startled, the woman looked up at him. He didn't hurry to avert his gaze. And in that moment, they both realized that fate wanted to tie their lives together.
If you're enjoying it as well, leave a like and subscribe to the channel.